Here's our master cylinder for our Dodge. What do you think of our sandblasting cabinet? We made this with about $30 worth of material, some scrap pieces of plywood and a piece of glass. We got some old top material here, canvas top material, and we sewed a pair of regular working gloves on it. It really makes a nice sandblasting cabinet. We also put a fitting over here off of a sweeper where we could hook our shop vac. That sucks all the fumes out, not all the fumes, but all the dust out of here, so you can see what you're doing. We're ready to go to work on our master cylinder. I've got the shop manual laid out here. I want to make sure that this thing all comes apart and matches the shop manual. Sometimes somebody might have put this thing together with some wrong pieces in it. So let's start taking it apart. Coming apart nice and easy. Take this cap that holds the boot on this other end. You can see the boot's all deteriorated. There should be a new one of those in a new kit. That's important too. It helps keep the moisture out of this thing. Let's slide these pieces out of here and see what we got. Check valve and spring. Piston and a rubber cup. So this is exactly how this came apart. And it's just exactly the way it shows it in the master cylinder breakdown here in the manual. Next thing we got to do, we're going to have to wash this up thoroughly. Take an air hose and blow all the holes out in it to make sure it's good and clean. There might be some gritty sand in there that could just destroy the system. So give me a minute here and I'll wash it out. Well, we got it all washed out. Let's see what we have here. Doesn't look too bad down inside here. There's holes down inside here that allow the fluid in the reservoir to run down into the cylinder part. You've got to make sure they're clean. Blow them out, take a wire, whatever's necessary. So right now we're going to take a cylinder hone. It's got little sanding little stones here. And this is a mixture of some oil and some mineral spirits. We're going to put that in there and turn it with the electric drill. And you don't want to do this, you don't want to let it stay in one place, just run it through, all the way through. Well, let's stick this rag through here and clean it out and see what we got. There's no pits at all. It really cleaned up nice. Let's open up this new kit and see what we got. Got the rubber boot. Here's the cup. It looks like it's right. The check valve. There's a ring for the cap. It's a check valve seat. These are identical. Looks like we got the right parts. Let's start putting it together. One of the things we need to do is use this brake cylinder lubricant. Keeps it from freezing up. Also keeps it from rusting. Just slide this right in the end here. Before I go any further, I want to show you something. When you hone this out, you should never go beyond 5 thousandths of the original diameter. It's dangerous. If you have any doubts about it, check with the mechanic someplace that maybe can steer you on the right path. But you can take a feeler gauge and slip down in there. And I'm not talking about one side, I'm talking about diameter. It should not increase any more than 5 thousandths from what you originally had. So let's finish up here. I'm going to install the new boot in here. Put the piston in here. Put the washer over it. Get these two screws in. Make sure you clean everything as you put it in. Next, we'll put in this new cup. Make sure we don't have any grit on it. We'll also lubricate it. Goes in there like this. Next thing we need to do is take this old valve off. There's a new valve. This rubber valve seat goes on top of it. We're going to take this is the old gasket off of this cap. Put the valve down on top of it. I better wipe this off again. That goes on top of that. You can always refer to your manual. It's got a total assembly there, and it's got a total breakdown. Feels good. It's finished. We're ready to put this on the car. If you remember, we left the backing plate loose on the rear axle housing. Well, we took it off, brought it over here, we sandblasted it, painted it black. Looks great. You're not going to see it, but it'll keep it from rusting. What we're going to do is overhaul the wheel cylinder, the rear wheel cylinder. We'll get this thing apart here. Boy, this really looks bad. I got a tip for you. When you get one of these things that's all rusted up like this and you can't get it apart, let me show you a little tip. When you got one of these things stuck like this, take an old piece of brake line or whatever and a fitting that'll fit in the hose opening. Screw it in there good and tight. And take a grease gun. Hydraulic pressure will usually push those out of there. Here it comes now. Take our line back out. Let's see if we can drive the other side out. There we go. Let's take a look at this, see what it looks like. Get some of the grease out of it. You want to wash this in alcohol. You also, when you get done, you want to take air hose and blow out all the orifices. As soon as we get it clean, we'll run a hone through it and see how it cleans up. Doesn't look too bad. We'll get a hone in there and see how it cleans up. Get this grease gun out of the way. Get our cylinder hone here. You have to keep this moving. You don't want to end up with a wide spot in there. You want to even all the way through. Clean it up here again, see what we have. Looks real good. I've got a couple little black rings in here. That's just a stain from the wheel cylinder cups. It won't hurt anything. I'm going to take the bleeder valve out of this thing, make sure that all those orifices are cleaned. And we're going to put it back in the alcohol. You don't want any grit in this thing. Also, it didn't take me very long to hone this thing out. It's a pretty good cylinder. I'm going to get the air hose and blow it off. When you hone yours out, you might have to hone it a little longer than what I did, but you got to be careful. You can't go too far. Just like the master cylinder, you can't enlarge this any more than about 5 thousandths. Really looks good. We'll get the new kit. We'll start assembling it. Next thing we need to do is lubricate the cylinder and also the cups. Again, this stuff keeps it from rusting and it'll keep the pistons from seizing up inside. I'm going to shove it through this way, put the piston in, take the spring and set it inside. Stick our cup in, our other piston. These two extra springs here, they're for the front wheel cylinders. This kit's the same for front or rear. I'll stick the new boots on. These new boots are very critical. It keeps the moisture out of the system. I realize it has nothing to do with the hydraulic, but it does keep the moisture out. My hands are a little slippery. It's hard to get this boot on. There, I got it. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to assemble it on this backing plate. Put our little piston rods in. Screw the breather back in, or with the bleeder, I'm sorry. These brakes on this car can be a real job to adjust. We're going to show you how we're going to do it. Got to tighten up these wheel cylinder bolts yet. Make sure they're good and tight. I want to show you something about these brake shoes. If you notice here, this brake shoe says forward. This is the right rear wheel. That'll go right over here. You're going to have to check your manual. A Lot of times these shoes are different length, or the lining is different length. One goes front, one goes in the rear. If you notice these, there are two different styles, two different types of lining. One's soft, one's hard. What we're going to do now is go ahead and start assembling it. Got it all together. Let me tell you something about these cylinders. We picked up an extra front wheel cylinder just to show you this. This one is all corroded too. You can handle this the same way we did this with hydraulic pressure from your grease gun. Just get a fitting that'll fit in here and pump it out. And hone it just like you would the other ones, and check it with a feeler gauge or whatever. Make sure that it's not honed too much. If you got a cylinder that is really bad and is total rust like this one is here, there's not much you can do with it. But there's a company called White Post in Virginia. They can take a cylinder like this and bore it out and insert a brass sleeve. It makes it as good as new, maybe even better than new. It'll probably last longer. Let me tell you something else about these cylinders. If you got a 50s model car, 60s, 70s, most of these are available. It's when you get into older cars that you're going to have a lot of problem with them. But even at your regular automotive store, these are available most of the time. Let me tell you something about the adjustment on these brakes. These are very difficult. They make a special tool to set these out so that they line up perfectly with the brake drum, because they're all anchored tight. You notice here we have a couple of arrows on these two lower adjustments. When you crank that arrow out this way, it shoves the shoe out. You bring it back like this, and it brings the shoe in as far as it can go. Same goes for these cams right here. Turn them in all the way. You need to get it in so you can get your brake drum over top of it. These are very difficult to adjust. You might have to get some help. These bottom adjustments have to be turned out until it just makes contact with the brake drum, and then just back it off about 6 thousandths. The same goes for these fronts. You're going to have to do it by feel. They did make a tool that you set this up, you put the tool over the spindle, you measure the drum, and you can adjust this out and have it perfect. I doubt if you'll find that tool. So you're just going to have to feel it out until you got it adjusted perfectly. Let me show you what a modern day. This is out of middle 50s all the way up to the present time. You don't have that critical adjustment with this. This adjustment right here sets it out close to the shoes. You turn it out until you lock up the drum, and then you just back it off enough to where the drum will roll free. These are anchored tight. That's the reason for all the special adjustments. Ray, you want to install this on the car? Next thing I want to show you, what I want to talk about is wheel bearings. Let me get this out of the way. This wheel bearing we've already cleaned up, blowed it all out with an air hose. And if you notice right here, one of the rollers is already starting to deteriorate. Won't take long for it to ruin the race. What we've done, we've already bought another set of wheel bearings for it, and we've already installed the race. We're going to pack this full of grease. We'll show you how that's done. Just put a little grease in the palm of your hand like this, and just force it in the open side here until it starts to come out this other side. All the way around. You want to make sure the whole bearing is packed full of grease. This is something really you don't have to do too often in a car, maybe about every 25,000 miles. You can see it's starting to come out through the other side. That's got it. We'll just drop it down in that new race. Let me show you something else here. Got another bearing here with the race we talked about putting in on the other bearing. This one's starting to get little chatter marks in it. You can see here just a little chatter marks. It won't be long before that's deteriorated too. Just something to look for. Well, we got both of those bearings packed. Get rid of some of this stuff. Next thing we're going to talk about are brake lines. We've already made up our brake lines. We bent them to the shape of the old lines and installed them on the chassis. There's a couple different ways you can go about this. You can buy these lines about a dozen different lengths. They're all made up with a special flare on them. And if some of them are too long for you, you might put a little extra bend in to compensate for that. But that isn't what we did. We went out and we bought a 25-foot roll of 3/16 special brake line. You can't use ordinary steel tubing. This is brake line tubing. And we got a flaring tool kit. We've got a pipe bender, a file, and a cutter. That's really about all you need. Let me show you how we do this. First off, we use this bender, very inexpensive tool. You just slip the tubing in like that and just roll it around this wheel. You can make these nice curves here and never kink the line. Next, we're going to flare this line. First thing we want to do is clean it out where we cut it off. Just make it as opening as big as it was before. And this is a cutter that we used. Next thing we do, we're going to take our tool and stick it in the vise. Makes it a lot easier to work on. Now we'll take our pipe. It's 3/16. This thing is marked with 3/16, quarter inch, and so forth. We'll just stick it in there, slide it around here, and snug it up. We're going to take a file and just make sure this is good and flat. If there's no burrs on it, it's not cut crossways. This little adapter here has got a shoulder on it. This line has to stick through the width of that shoulder. There we go. Tighten it up good and tight. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stick this adapter in this hole. Put this tool over top of it and crank it down till it bottoms out. There we go. So the next thing we do, stick this back on here with the adapter removed. And we tighten it up again. Should all be finished. We'll take it out of our tool. We got a nice double flare end on this. If you have any questions about this, this kit came with some good instructions and diagrams. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to work on this caliper off of that Pontiac suspension we had. I've already taken this someplace and had a glass bead it. You don't want to sandblast it. Again, sand could impregnate in this. So I've also washed it out. I took an air hose, I blew out all the openings, blew out all the orifices. So what we're going to do now is take this seal and stick it down in this groove. It's a little hard to get in there, but There we go. Got to make sure that's good and clean. You don't want no dirt in that groove. Okay, next we'll put this seal on. This seal goes over and fits right in this groove. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to take some more of this lubricant and lubricate this seal plus the inner part of this caliper. This sealer, or this lubricant, is also designed to keep it from rusting or seizing. Lubricate the outside of this. These can be hard to get in sometimes. You really have to work with them. When you start this in there, make sure that you don't get it cocked sideways. It's a very close fit. Sometimes you got to use a C-clamp to get that in. It can be very difficult. We'll pull it up here a little bit and start our seal in. This big seal, start it in the back edge, work it around, and take something and just tap it into place. It's in here good and tight. Now we're going to put the brake pads in. I took the clip off of the old brake shoes. They snap over just like this. This sits down in here like this. This clip goes down inside this piston. The other shoe fits like this. One thing you got to do yet, you see these tabs here? You can see the play we got in here. You want this so it's tight. So you just bend this over. Just take it like this. Bend it down until you can put it in there, and then just snap this up over this place right here till it's good and tight and you don't have that play in it. Spread these apart a little bit, and this is ready to install in the car. Just want to show you something about the rotor. We've had it refaced. Machine Shop did it. If you notice here, it says minimum thickness, and here's your dimensions. You never want them to cut this beyond that. It'll make it unsafe. Most automotive shops, they'll check that. They won't even ask you. They'll check it. They'll want to sell you a new rotor if it's been cut down too many times. But this is ready to go on the car. Well, you can see we got our front brake all finished. You see the two separate cylinders, new brake shoes. We painted the backing plate. Looks great. We're going to put our hub and drum on. Put the bearing in it. It's already been packed. Put the washer in it. Make sure it's always got that little tab there so it never turns. We'll put our nut on it. I'm going to take this nut, I'm going to take a big wrench, and I'm going to tighten it up as tight as I can get it. And the reason I'm doing that, I want to make sure that all the bearings are seated and that the seal's not holding me out. I loosened it back up. I'm going to pull this thing up with a pair of pliers. just until the drum turns free. And I'll put my cotter key in it. Put the dust cover over it. You have to get a hammer and put that on a little tighter. But we're ready to bleed the brakes after we make the adjustments here on this wheel.
Boy, what do you think of this frame? Isn't it pretty? All painted black. New brake lines all throughout. Got our differential housing put in here. The way we knew I had our brake lines back in the proper place was we used our photographs here that we took before we took them apart. We also used the old lines. Fred, I think we're ready to bleed these brakes.
Okay. Now we've already put some fluid in this system, and we've already bled the right rear. Now we're working on the left rear. When we get finished, we're going to move to the right front. We're going to bleed the lower cylinder, then the upper one, and move to the left front and do the same thing. So you want to keep this cylinder filled at all the time. If you don't, you're going to be pumping air back into the system. We're using silicone brake fluid. The government uses this in their military vehicles. This won't absorb water like regular brake fluid. It'll stay good and clean for years, where regular fluid will absorb water and cause rust in the cylinders. This is great stuff. It has a boiling point of a lot higher than the regular brake fluid. Another thing I want to point out to you, this is a breather here on this cap. All these caps on these old master cylinders have a breather hole in them. You got to make sure that's open and clear. If it isn't, this fluid is not going to be able to drain down into the cylinder, the fluid that's in the reservoir. It won't drain down in there because it needs to have air to do that. After we got this cylinder on, we made sure this big nut here in the back was good and tight. Another thing I might point out to you, when this body's on this car and you're checking the brakes, make sure there's no dirt around. If you knock a little dirt into that hole and it gets down into that cylinder, it's going to ruin everything that you've already done. You're not going to be able to get brakes on it. Are you ready, Ray?
I'm ready to go.
Boy, there was air come out that time. No, it wasn't. What we're doing, I'm letting a little fluid run down in this cylinder, pumping it up and getting good pressure in it. And then Ray cracks that bleeder in the back and runs that fluid down into that jar.
Fred, I don't see any bubbles coming back here. You ought to be getting a pretty good pedal up there.
I have.
Got a pretty good pedal?
Yeah, once we get the fronts done, it'll be better.
All right. Okay, now as soon as we get through bleeding all these brakes, we're going to hold some pressure on the master cylinder, and we're going to check all these fittings all the way around the automobile. That way, as Fred holds pressure, if I see there's a leak, we can make some corrections or tighten the line up.
The next thing we need to do is check the free travel. The book says about 3/4 to 1 inch. It looks like we have just about 1 inch. Let me show you why. These two openings in this bottom of this reservoir, this C and B, when you push this pedal in, you're pushing fluid back up through this hole before you ever, when it passes this hole, then you're starting to create pressure and applying your brakes. Your secondary cup here pushes this fluid that runs down through here back up into the reservoir. When you release your brakes and this comes back, it opens this hole up. One of the reasons for that is when you drive this car and you work those brakes and they get hot and that fluid get hot, it's going to expand that fluid and it's going to put pressure back in that master cylinder if you got that hole covered. If you don't have that hole covered like we got here, it'll just push that fluid back up into the reservoir. If that hole is blocked and that fluid expands, it can only expand at your wheel cylinders. It's going to push your cups out and apply your brakes. It's going to lock it up. You have to make sure that you have this free travel. One way to do this is take the cap off of it, move the pedal that far, and watch it. You can see the fluid come back up through here. That manual is the best tool that you've got. Don't try the job without it. There is all kind of specifications in there, all torque specifications, brakes, whatever. If you have any doubts as to what you've done here as far as the brakes and front suspension, enlist the help of a mechanic just to make sure everything is safe.
Well, I hope we shared a lot of useful information with you today. Be sure and be with us on our next tape on sheet metal. You'll really enjoy it.
It's easy. You can do it yourself.